Light intensity. So light intensity is another light characteristic I wanted to briefly talk about. Light intensity is basically has to do with the amount of light, how much light hits your subject. Now let's start with the obvious thing. You need light in photography. The absence of light means there is no photograph. Light is what creates the image. Light is what creates the image by bouncing off of the objects in your frame and hitting your lens. So the reason you can see me right now is because the light hit my face and reflected back into the lens of this camera. That is the reason why you can see me right now. If there was no light, you would not be able to see me. It's that simple. Now, of course, we're looking at different ranges of how much light you could be working with. So it could be just a little bit of light, or it could be a lot of light. If you have just a little bit of light, you're running into a problem where it might not be enough for your camera to capture a good image. As a matter of fact, let me show you right now. So you see all this grain right here and really all over the place? All that messy, grainy image? Well, the reason you see this is because our cameras need light, and our cameras need much more light than our eyes do. If you walk into a darkish room, you see a dark room, you don't see grain all over the place, right? I mean, a grain is kind of a thing that cameras create because of their limitations. It is very important for you to understand that our eyes do not need as much light as our cameras. Or to flip it, it's important for you to remember that the cameras usually need much more light than our eyes do. Beginner photographers are often disappointed when they're sitting maybe in somewhat of a dark room taking a picture of something or somebody, which might look like a really nice setting, but then the picture looks very grainy. Again, you see a grain just like this. And that is the limitation of our cameras. So remember that you need a minimum amount of light to be able to capture an image. Now, the good news is that our cameras are becoming better and better. And every year you see companies like Nikon and Canon and Red and so on come up with cameras that are better at capturing great images in low light. But still, you should be paying attention and making sure that you do have enough light when you shoot. Much better, right? You don't really see that grain? This is definitely enough light for this camera to capture a decent image. So let's talk about the flip side. The flip side being having too much light. And when you have too much light, things are overexposed. And actually what you're looking at right now is once again a pretty good example. So my face is pretty well exposed and you can see detail, maybe more than I would want you to. But pay attention to this area of the frame right here. Do you see how it's completely white? You don't really see any texture over here. It's just like completely white block over there. That's overexposed. That looks like too much light. So we had too little light creates problems, too much light creates problems too. So again, we're talking about light intensity, how strong the light is. You kind of have to find the happy medium where you just get enough light but not too much light. So here's another very important thing for you to understand as a photographer. In many cases, you can control your light sources. So if you have a lighting kit, you can actually decide how much light you want to use by turning a little knob or moving the lighting kit a little bit farther or closer to the subject, or using more than one, maybe using 2, 3 different lamps. So you can control the amount of light. You can by controlling the light sources. But another thing that's very important for you to understand as a photographer is that you can control the amount of light that falls into your camera too. And later on, I will be talking in the upcoming weeks, I will be talking about changing the aperture and shutter speed and all of these different things. but your camera has the ability to control how much light falls into that camera and creates an image. Which means something very important, which means that you might be outside and you might be looking at something or somebody that appears really dark in contrast to maybe a really, really bright blue sky or highlights on the building. And you might think to yourself, well, they look really dark. I don't want to end up with a dark photograph. I don't want them to be underexposed. Not realizing that actually you can do quite a lot with these things, where you can decide, even if somebody is standing in the shade, to open up just enough where you still get a nice image even though they're still standing in the shade. Even though they appear to be dark because they're standing in the shade, most of the time they appear to be dark because they appear to be dark in contrast to the really bright surroundings. But once you get closer and you expose for them, they might actually have enough light to create a beautiful image. On the flip side, you might see somebody who appears really, really bright, or you might see something or that you want to take a picture of that appears really bright, and you think to yourself, well, this looks so bright. I don't really want to have a bright image. You can adjust your camera. You can change the aperture in your camera where you can compensate for that as well. So it is very important for you to start realizing that the amount of light that falls onto a subject can create many different results depending on the camera settings. Because you might have a huge amount of light falling onto something, but you still have control over how much of that light reflects back into the camera, how much of that light will you let into your camera. So the bottom line is intensity. Another light characteristic has to do with the amount of light that falls onto your subject.